There we go. All right. So it is good to see all of you.
Thank you, music team. Thank you all for participating in congregational worship this morning. And so glad to be here. And we're continuing our study in the book of Hebrews. And we have invested a lot of study and service time into this incredible letter. A letter that has been written for a community of believers that is much like our community of believers, our church. But at the same time, it's different. Mainly the reason is because this was a Jewish community that was receiving this letter. And they had a great deal of knowledge for the Old Testament and an astronomically high reverence for the Old Testament. And majority of these Hebrews have been transformed by the message of the gospel that has infiltrated their city. Some not so much so, at least not yet. Others are hostile towards it, and they've assimilated into the body, not to draw near to Jesus, but to pull away from Jesus, to pull some from Jesus. Nevertheless, they were all extremely familiar to the Old Testament, the law, the sacrificial system, and the prophets. So the letter was more than likely read in a small group setting. All right, so I want us to understand that. So whenever you're reading this letter as an individual, you need to understand this was being read in a small group, much like some of our small groups that meet every week. It was read in one setting, so it was a sermon. Depending on your reading speed, you would probably be able to read this book in about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. And so now we're in our 28th message, though, meaning that we've preached 28 messages, approximately 40 to 50 minutes in each setting. That's because we're not like the original audience. We're not very familiar with the Old Testament, so we have to take time to ground ourselves in the Old Testament knowledge that comes along with this book. So I want you to understand that today because it's very, very important as we are now navigating into the 13th chapter, that this is one flowing thought from Hebrews 1:1 to the end of this book. And so these people have been listening, and imagine your entire religious thought process has been rocked as you are seeing, you're connecting the dots of Jesus and the Old Testament. So the writer wrote this letter to send it to be read for the primary purpose to ground genuine converts, to appeal to yielding ears, and to expose the fakers in the forms of warnings. He's doing so by using what they know to show them that they may not actually know as much as they thought. Meaning the Old Testament was a picture of the coming new covenant in Jesus Christ, fulfilling all righteousness. So that brings us to chapter 13. All right? And there's no way that I can bring us all up to speed once more on everything that we have gone over. So I encourage you all to go listen or watch the tapes or the videos on YouTube. If you are not well caught up, I encourage you to do that anyway. I do it, and I've watched Pastor Matt's sermon from a couple of weeks ago 4 times. And just so I could really grasp what he's doing. Repetition is the greatest teacher. I recognize that you're not going to probably remember everything I say today. In fact, I would be shocked if you remember more than 5%. So I want to encourage you to go back. We keep these and archive these so that you can become grounded in how to interpret the Old Testament, which is the purpose of this book. But I want to make sure that we're all on the same page today. I'm going to be transparent with you for a moment, is that I've been up since 2:15 this morning. Recently, I've been struggling a little bit with sleep, and this morning I just said, why fight it? Just get up. And during that time, I decided, I don't know why, I just felt impressed to read through the book of Hebrews. That's why I can tell you it's going to take you an hour to an hour and 15 minutes to do it. Okay? So I read through it this morning, and I began to do what I normally do, is I just started highlighting things that stick out to me. That's why I thoroughly enjoy having a Bible app, because you can recurringly highlight new things and erase old things. And so, looking through the book this morning, I felt it'd be necessary for us to really lay the groundwork that you can't go straight to a to-do list in the Christian walk. Now, a church, a local church, I find, should be a place where exhortation starts with the heart through the gospel. We have to understand that the heart is desperately wicked. In fact, the prophet Jeremiah says that it's so wicked that you can't even know how wicked it is. That means that you had to have a new heart transplanted into you in order for you to understand and believe and live out what the gospel preaches. And in reading this book this morning, I noticed some things that are essential for the local church to emphasize and understand even more. And I feel like it's often overlooked and maybe even forgotten in preaching and in teaching. Sometimes we can get so caught up in the text, or we get caught up in traditions, we get caught up in our routines, that we miss what we're supposed to be doing. And I'm actually talking to myself as a preacher. I'm talking to myself as a teacher. Remember, Hebrews is a flowing thought, one flowing thought. We need to first see the direct exhortations that have come throughout this book. You need to understand today, as you read back through, that the writer of this book did not give a direct exhortation. Now let me stop there for definition of terms. When we say direct exhortation, what we're saying is a direct exhortation is like, Jaden, go clean your room. Okay? It's direct, it's specific, it's addressing someone. In this book, when he says you, or he compels us, that is a direct exhortation. He didn't do his first one until the 3rd chapter of the book. He laid groundwork of doctrine. He gave a stern warning, but he was giving a warning and saying there is this possibility of drifting in the faith. But as far as the direct exhortation, they did not begin until chapter 3. Can I just rattle these off for you? I marked all of them, highlighted them. I may have missed one, but I don't think so. Verse 1. Do you know what the direct exhortation is? Consider Jesus, the apostle and the high priest of our confession. In verse 8 of chapter 3, do not harden your hearts. I want to see if you catch the theme here. In verse 9, he says, take care. Pay attention. In chapter 4, verse 1, let us fear. In verse 11 of chapter 4, let us strive to enter that rest. Chapter 6, verse 1, let us leave the elementary doctrines of the faith. That means let us not just look at the ABCs, the beginning portion of the faith, which is the Old Testament. Don't just get stuck in the Old Testament and become moralistic. He says, leave those things and go on to maturity. And then from that verse, that small phrase right there, we do not see an exhortation, direct exhortation, until chapter 10. Where he says in verse 22 of that chapter, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. And then in verse 23, let us hold fast the confession of our faith without wavering. Let's stop there for a moment. We're basically 3/4 of a way through the book. I just summarized the exhortations. And every direct exhortation to this point is dealing with your thinking and believing in Jesus. It is vertical and it is inward.
but it is about you and the gospel. The first direct exhortation that is not vertical is found in the very next verse from what we just read. Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as a habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. In other words, be consistently thinking about how to be around your church family more. That's what the exhortation is. But I want you to understand, this is the first horizontal. You understand what I mean when I say horizontal relationship? Vertical is between us and God. All right, we got 4 commandments that is vertical. And then the latter 6 is horizontal commandments, how we are to respond with our neighbors. This is the first one. And yet, guess what? It's not a to-do. It's still dealing with the inward. Did you get it? He said, let us consider. Let us think about it. Let us ponder on it. And then he goes back to vertical in verse 35 of chapter 10. Do not throw away your confidence. Guess what? Still inward. He's not telling us to do anything with our hands yet. He's not telling us to go do anything. He's not talking about any of that. And then we've got the great hall of faith. Not one exhortation in the hall of faith. Then we begin in chapter 12. Let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Guess what? Philosophical, allegorical, still, he's pleading with our passions. He hasn't told us to do anything yet. In verse 3, consider him, just like he started in chapter 3. Consider Jesus. Verses 12 and 13. Lift up your drooping hands. This is still figuratively. All right, he hasn't told us. He's not saying literally, put your hands up in the air. He's saying strengthen the weak knees and make the path straight. This is still all inward. Verse 25. Do not refuse him who is speaking. This is still inward. This is still addressing how we listen. Verse 28. Let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe. And I want you to understand today that 18 short phrases of exhortation out of 278 verses. All direct exhortations are dealing here with the thoughts, fears, the energy, desires, knowledge, assurance, your identity, praise, thanksgiving, and worship. But this writer has not told us one thing to do outwardly yet. Think about that. What is the point? What am I driving home? The reason I'm emphasizing this with you is because it would be real easy to take chapter 13, which, by the way, some believe that it wasn't actually a part of the original letter, but that has been debunked. It's easy to take chapter 13 and treat it like its own book. Why? Because he starts getting into a list. The point here is the writer, just like the apostles, just like Jesus, focus on the heart of the matter. My question is, why don't preachers do that? Why don't teachers do that? I mean, I'm tired of watching videos and I'm seeing like motivational speakers, okay? And they're telling you to do this. Or on the other side, they're not motivational. They just totally demoralize you. You're just absolutely beaten up because they give you all this list of things that you're supposed to do. And they do it, and you know what they do? They assume the gospel. I believe it was Spurgeon that said this: to assume the gospel is to not preach the gospel. I want you to make sure you understand today, before we get into any of this exhortation that is direct, and guess what it is? It's outward. There's an outward emphasis in this exhortation today. but it has been built on a foundation that is sure in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And because of that, I don't know if pastors or what drives them to just focus on things. I think some of it may be because they would rather have results than have the real thing. Because the real thing is slow. How many of you realize that? Sanctification is slow. The growing and nurturing of a healthy church is slow. I have found it to be a mark in my own life. Anything that gets built overnight can crumble overnight. And some would rather have the fast results, the real thing. And so what they do is they give you the things. Do this, do this, do this, do this. Because they don't want to get messy. And they recognize that it could even be painful to watch. Slow growth. To watch the slow thing can be painful. Or it could be because of pressure. Because people naturally don't want teaching that calls them to look beyond the surface of their own skin. Think about it. We wrestle with that, don't we? We wrestle with the fact that sin is in us, and we like to think it's just on us. So we want to stay surface level, light, shallow. So what do? We pressure our leaders to just give me a to-do list. Just tell me what to do. And in that, preachers have become accustomed to just telling you what to do, assuming the gospel to the detriment of their people. Because rather than addressing the heart, they just address the hands. And the problem is this: if you start with the to-dos, you will have manufactured religion, not the gospel. Meaning, the gospel in manufactured religion isn't what is changing your life. It's fear. It's guilt. It's pride. And none of those things will save you. In fact, Jesus came to save you from those things. So I want you to understand that a local church is a place where exhortation starts with the inward through the gospel. But now we're in chapter 13. And there's something else we need to be looking for in our local church, in our church family. And that is genuine affection and care that keeps growing. Let's look in the chapter together. Let brotherly love continue. Again, inward. He's dealing with the affections. That word let, it means to allow or to encourage, to grant, to approve. Basically what the writer is saying here, don't cause a blockage. Because the word continue means remain or keeping on. That word continue at the latter portion of that verse gives us the implication of something that is already going on. He didn't say start giving brotherly love. He says let it continue. Brotherly love, it comes from the word Philadelphia, phileo, where we get, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Which really isn't a city of brotherly love. I don't know why they call it that. I don't know anyway. They booed Santa on Monday Night Football. Come on. All right? So what are we supposed to keep flowing through our church? Well, here in the English, we have the word love. Brotherly love is together. It's actually one Greek word, as we've already mentioned. But what is brotherly love? It's not agape, that love that I would die for them, okay? There's a love that he is specifically talking about here intentionally. It's not eros. It's not something that's emotional, okay? The three different Greek words. You got eros, you got phileo, you have agape. We just described eros as this warm, fuzzy feeling. Whenever you see like a newborn baby and you're like, oh, that's eros, okay? Or you got agape, which is like, the strong love that you probably have for your children, It's like, listen, I would die for them, and if someone were trying to hurt them, if the last thing possible to ensure their survival, I'd probably kill for them, to stop it, to protect them. That's agape. That's the love that Jesus describes, where he says that there's no greater love than a man or a woman who is willing to lay down their life for their friend. That's agape love. Now, he's not dismissing those loves, okay? But here he is emphasizing phileo. Putting this together, this brotherly love. How would you describe phileo? I would define it as this. He's telling us to treasure each other. Now, when we think of treasures, obviously we're thinking about, money, or we're thinking about possessions, we're thinking about things. But you would understand, those of you who are married, that once you've gotten married, you begin to treasure flesh and blood. You begin to treasure the one that you're spending the rest of your life with. There's areas that you treasure absolutely about her or him. And then another form of that takes place when you have children. You treasure. You treasure the time. You don't take it for granted. It's something special. It's genuine. It's a cherishing. And you'll do whatever it takes to guard that. To let them know that you're loved. That you love them. It's phileo. Inward, remember? He's still in inward exhortation right now. That's direct to us. And he's saying, don't block brotherly love or treasuring each other. You're treasuring each other, but let it continue on. Do you treasure God's people? You know what treasuring is? Treasuring is Philippians 2:3, which is just displaying the attitude that Christ had. When we said, let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, humility, let each esteem others better than themselves. Treasure people. Treasure your brothers and your sisters in Christ. As I said, once again, he's dealing with the inward issue. He doesn't say, take meals to people. He doesn't say, write letters. He doesn't say, visit the sick church family members. He just says, keep treasuring each other. So let me give you the introductory statement, because we're about to look at some very poignant outward expressions or outward exhortations. But I feel like we've got to make sure that we have this statement in order to ground us for the bulk portion of not just this week's sermon, but as we finish out this chapter. And it's this: only a gospel-centered community can follow specific exhortations without compromising the message of the gospel. It's packed, but make sure you don't miss it. Only a gospel-centered community can follow specific exhortations. What? Exhortations like meals to people, writing letters or sending text messages, visiting sick people. Only a gospel-centered community can do those things without compromising the message of the gospel. Basically saying this: if you're not grounded in the gospel, you will make those things ways that you demonstrate your righteousness. And you think that those things is what saves you. But if you're not grounded in the gospel, you're in danger of that. You can't assume the gospel, and this writer has not done that. So let's look in verse 2 together. Now we're going to outward exhortations. Do not neglect to show. Outward exhortation. Hospitality to strangers. For thereby some have entertained angels unawares. The word neglect here means to ignore or to overlook, to dismiss, to forget about, to undervalue. And what the writer is saying is, do not overlook or dismiss or undervalue shown hospitality to strangers. The word show means to the displaying, the acting out, an outward expression. That word hospitality, well, what do you think about when you think about hospitality? Well, like Martha Stewart, okay? Okay, like there's this, hospitality. I remember in those times where there was committees, you got hospitality committee and so forth. Basically, it meant that they're the ones that set up and decorate for the meals, or they make sure that people, are given something at the door. But the word hospitality, the root word of that is the word hospital. And from that, we get this message that our presence, our actions are to be a source of medication for the soul of strangers. Hospital. We don't go to the hospital to get flowers, right? No, you go to the hospital because you're sick. And you go there with hopes of being made well. So this picture here is, do not undervalue an outward expression of healing to strangers. Spiritual healing, emotional healing. The word strangers here, now when we think of strangers, what do we teach our children? Don't talk to strangers. I'm still a proponent of that. Okay? But this word stranger here is literally a title that in those cultures was a title for the estranged. Describing the hungry, describing the widows, the orphans, the downcast, the struggling. Philoexnia is that word. This of displaying hospitality to strangers. We got Philadelphia in verse 1. We have Philoexnia in verse 2. And he says this first outward expression of the entire book is regarding your relationship with people you don't know. Think about that. He said, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. How many of you have heard that before? Well, you better be nice to them. You have no idea. It might be an angel. Is that what that means? Is that what that text is really talking about? It's actually a reference to the Old Testament. Genesis 18, 3 individuals come up on Abraham's area of inhabitation. And they're strangers. They're called strangers. And Abraham, as ancient culture would do, was hospitable to strangers. In fact, it was viewed as something virtuous for you to do that. He brought them in unbeknownst to him. 2 of them were angels. And the Bible says that the third one was the Lord. And so that's reference here. It's saying here is like Abraham had no idea when he was doing this who these individuals were. And that's this reference here. But what is the purpose? Why would he put that in there? Well, I think it's the emphasis because you have no idea who you are. He uses the word entertaining. Who you are talking to. who you are being kind to. You have no idea. Angels, maybe. Genesis 18. God's children. That's a possibility. In fact, I think that carries more weight than angels. Think about that. That person could be either a child of God or on their journey to being adopted by God. Think about that. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 17 says this, the Lord is speaking, "For the Lord your God is the God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. He executes justice to the fatherless," orphans, strangers, "the widows, and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing." And what does he say? What's the application to that? What does God tell Israel? Love the stranger. "Therefore, you were strangers in the land of Egypt, and I provided food and clothing for you." So it could be God's children. What does James 4 say? What's pure and undefiled religion? Taking care of the widows and the orphans, the strangers, the hungry. I was reminded of an allegory and that I heard in a sermon somewhere. I tried to research it and find it, but I couldn't. But there was a great king who grew concerned for his city, for his nation. And because of that, do you know what the issue was? It was hospitality. Everyone was out for themselves. Over time, the citizens of this nation grew selfish, self-consumed, all about themselves, all about their properties. Concerned for this, the king did something unthinkable. He sent his child into the community. Now, the child is not like today, like the royal family where there's paparazzis and people. No, lived a very private life, guarded that because of enemies of other nations, didn't want that to be known. So the people would have absolutely no idea that the prince and the princess were living among them. But one day the king comes out and makes an announcement and calls for all those under his reign to come and listen. He sends out notes to all in posts and lets them know that my prince, my son, and my daughter are living amongst you. And so, do you want to know what the response of all the people were? Well, who are they? And the king refused to tell. So guess what the people had to do? Treat everybody like royalty. I think that's the heart here. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. For they may be angels unaware. Yeah, maybe an angel. But what about if they're one of God's children? You want two definites? Two definites that Scripture tells us. Why should we be kind to strangers? Why should we be hospitable? Why should we not be cynical? By the way, I'm preaching to myself right now. I drive down the same roads you drive down. I stop at the same stoplights that you stop at. I'm approached by the same people that you're approached by. I am. And I find myself, as I used not to be as much this way, cynical. But what if they're an angel? But more importantly, what about if they're God's child? But let me give you a definite. They're an image bearer of God. That's a definite. There's no question about that. They bear the image of God. Why would I not, in some way, if it's through a kind word or if it's through exhortation? What about if it's just asking them questions and talking to them? What about if it's directions? What about if it is something like that? Hey, it may be giving them money. We're going to find out later that what stops us most of the time is because we love money. Which in turn tells us that we're not content. Let me give you one more definite. In fact, how about this? I'll let Jesus give you the definite. Okay? In Matthew 25. Remember last week we were talking about the kingdom? Jesus says this in verse 34. Then the king will say, who's the king? Who's the king of the kingdom? Jesus, okay? Will say to those on his right, come, you are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. So this kingdom has been in preparation mode since the foundation of the world. This is what the king said. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was hungry. I was thirsty. I was a stranger. I was naked, and you clothed me. Oh, I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when, he says, and when did we see you as a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? When did we do these things? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? Verse 40. And the king will answer them. Okay? This is going to happen. Okay? And the king, remember who's the king? Jesus. And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. Possibility. Could be an angel. Possibility. It could be one of God's children. Definite. They're an image bearer. Definite. When you do it to them, you're doing it to Christ. Hospitality. The first outward exhortation of this entire letter. What is the message? Be sure that you are not overlooking the estranged of society. Number 2. So he deals with hospitality, and then he deals with empathy. I struggle with empathy. I'm like, suck it up, buttercup. Right? Some of you can empathize with me, right? Oh, you don't feel well this morning? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, guess what? There's 5,000 other people in this town that had to go to work. So come on, get up, you know? That's the way I am, all right? I struggle with that, and I've been praying that God will help me with that because guess what? I'm laughing, but that's wrong. And here, of all the things that this writer could address, the second outward exhortation is empathy. So how do you get empathy out of this? Look in the verse 3 with me. Remember those who are in prison. Now, let's contextualize that for a moment, okay? Remember means reflect, ponder, think about. That implies that they were privy to some information. In order for them to remember that somebody was in prison, they had to know that they were in prison, right? Okay? So what he is saying is, don't let that flee from your mind. Let that stay fresh in your mind. Now, some would take this text and have taken this text that we need to start a prison ministry. Okay? Now, I'm not against prison ministries. There's been a lot of fruit for the gospel that has come through prison ministries. But that's not the primary source for this emphasis. Remember in chapter 10, he emphasized that many had been put in prison because of their faith. So what he is saying here, remember those who are suffering, and the reason they're suffering is because of the gospel. Because of that. I mean, it's like if you go and to sit down with someone and you're saying, you know, hey, I want to give you encouragement here, and you go sit down with them at the prison and say, so why are you in here? Well, tax evasion. Okay. Yeah. Or you talk to someone else, unpaid parking tickets. Yeah. Okay. And you keep going on, and it's all these things that they did. Listen, we want to witness to them, and we're hoping that if they're not proud of that and say, yeah, I only got to stay in here for a little while in jail or whatever, I'm hoping that they'll say, don't tell anybody that you're a Christian, if you're proud of that. But it would be like sitting down with somebody, why are you in here? Well, it was either renounce Christ or be in prison. And I chose Christ. And the writer here says, keep those people fresh on your mind. Do you realize right now that there has never been an era where more people are being persecuted for the cause of Christ than the day that we live in? Never. Greater than the days of Rome? And that should be sobering to us. But honestly, that's not really the emphasis either. Because he says this, you said empathy. How do you get remember and empathy? Well, it's not really the word remember, but it's in the next phrase. Remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them. Does that stir you when people are being persecuted for the cause of Christ? Because of their faith? And, I mean, does that ever keep you up at night? Not because of fear saying, oh, I don't know if it's going to come here, but brokenhearted, praying for them. We pray for that often. We've begun praying more about it in our corporate worship gatherings. But guys, with empathy, we need to make sure that we are empathetic for those who are suffering for the cause of Christ. But it is a spirit of empathy. If we're going to use some allegorical terms here, what about people who are living in the prison of addiction? What about people who are struggling? What about people who are being mistreated right now? People who are being, I'm going to use a word that's kind of a hot word right now, but it's actually a biblical word, so I'm going to use it, who are oppressed. Think about that. Do you just pass that off? Listen, don't become like Darwinites. Those are products of evolution to say, well, you know what? The strong will survive. Don't be like me, buck up, buttercup. But put yourself in their position. Empathize. Of all the things that this writer, think about everything, that the sacrificial system, greater than Moses, Jesus is better, all of this. He's dealing with hospitality of strangers and empathy towards those who are being mistreated. Carry on in the verse. And those who are mistreated. Why though? Since you also are in the body. So what's the context here? Well, obviously there's an emphasis here of the community of believers. Everything's very fresh for them, what's been going on. People have been mistreated, been financially taken advantage of, possessions have been taken. And he's saying be sensitive to that. Remember that. Keep that fresh. Go encourage them. Be there for them. Be kind to them. But why do we need to do this? If we're not careful, we can become justice warriors and we can become all about the cause, right? But if we're not careful, the cause will make us manufacture a religion. That's why we have emphasized there has to be a grounding in the gospel. The reason we want justice, the reason we want to be there for those who are struggling and empathize with them is because this breaks the heart of God. And he is calling on His church. He is calling on His people to be rooted in the gospel and to go out and be there and be hospitable, be healing to those who are strangers, and to be empathetic, not harsh, not whatever. I mean, good gracious, guys. The world seems to be more passionate about it than us. That shows you that embedded in every individual, there is a demand for justice. There is. The problem is the world doesn't know what to do with it. They don't know what justice is. So if the Christians are just going to stay back, if believers, if the community, if Emmanuel Church is just going to stay back and just say, okay, let them starve. It's about my four and no more. If Emmanuel's going to stay back and just say it's about making sure our building's pretty or making sure that we grow so we get a bigger building, you know what? All we've done is we've turned this into an enterprise. If we're cynical and we're not empathetic, and if we're not looking deep into it, we're just telling the world you can have them. And guess what? Basically what we're saying, and excuse my language, but we're saying damn true justice. Condemn true justice. Damn true mercy. Condemn true mercy. You see, this isn't something light that the writer is addressing here. It's actually really deep. Because he's cutting at the core of who we really are. We naturally sit back. We're naturally passive. And he's calling us to arms. He's calling us to step up to the plate. Rooted in the gospel. We're not doing this because we're righteous. Let me tell you why. Application and conclusion. Why do we do this? Well, if it's not compelling enough, the fact is you could be ministering to angels and you could be ministering to God's children and you are going to be ministering to image bearers, and you are ministering to Christ Himself. How about this? Of all the people in the world that could have been above it, Jesus wasn't above it. Jesus identifies with the abused. He identifies with the outcast. After all, He was abused. In fact, do you know what Jesus said? Jesus said, I'll take their abuse for them. I'll take the outcasting for them. It feels light, doesn't it? I mean, hospitality is such a beautiful word. Okay? Empathy, all that sweet. But man, this is tough stuff. What keeps you up at night? Is it the stock market? Is it the news? What keeps you up? Was it the person that you passed on the street or that came to your car and asked you for a couple of dollars? How many of you have been guilty of saying, sorry, man, I ain't got nothing on me? I'm guilty of that. When the truth of the matter is, I could walk right in there and get them $5. You say, well, Blake, they're going to buy booze with it. Guess what? That's not my business. That's God's business. In fact, why don't you do this? Why don't you be intentional and talk to them for a while about the gospel? Why don't you say, I want you to know that the reason that I'm doing this is because this is what Jesus did for me. Jesus, when I was in need, Jesus met my need. You say, Blake, you're asking a lot. I know I'm asking a lot, especially in Southern culture. Because we're all about the American dream. By the way, that's the greatest lie that has ever been told in Western civilization. Why don't we just say, hey, let's be greedy. Let's be about ourselves. Let's build ourselves. You know, the self-made man, that's another big lie. Ain't no person ever been self-made. You say, my sweat and brow, who gave you your energy? Who got you up and gave you breath? You didn't make anything. By God's grace, He gave it to you. And guess what? This is something that we do in our house. We're going to glorify God and show His grace. And one of our tenets is through His treasures. And 2 points under that is we need to understand that we are to be givers, not hoarders. And we are managers, not owners. You say, Blake, you're talking about money. Well, there's a reason why it says the root of all evil is the love of money. Hospitality. Empathy. Are you empathetic? You're saying, am I supposed to give it all away? Well, I'm saying, make sure you got food, make sure you got shelter, make sure you got clothing. Make sure you're being a good steward. Have discernment. I'm not telling you just be blind and just start throwing $100 bills out the window. You know? I'm not telling you that. But I'll never forget a statement that was made by a pastor. He said the sign, and we've used it even in this study, but the sign of true generosity is not how much you give. It's how much you keep. Let that sink in. Of all the things that he could have started off this final chapter with this unbelievable grounding of the gospel, he says, have hospitality. Have empathy. Let's pray together.